In this video, I'll be evaluating the constraints-led approach to skill acquisition while examining my ability to learn and execute a handstand using this method. A handstand is a complex skill whereby an individual attempts to maintain a vertical inverted posture by balancing and supporting their weight on their hands and wrists. To perform this skill, vestibular, proprioceptive, and visual systems provide important sensory information to the CNS in an attempt to maintain posture by controlling torque at each subsequent joint to maintain balance. This is known as a single-segment inverted control strategy, a form of information-action coupling whereby torque is controlled at the most inferior joint with subsequent compensatory torques from each superior joint segments acting in the same direction, enabling the body to maintain a fixed inverted posture. During protruded and unperturbed balance in a handstand, 75% of anterior-posterior sway is controlled by the wrist using this strategy. Furthermore, expert gymnasts utilize perception-action coupling by fixing their gaze on a visual anchoring point located 5 centimeters in front of the space between each hand. This point indicates the optimal vertical projection of the center of gravity, enabling the performer to stabilize the movement. The use of these strategies enable the performer to coordinate and self-organize different components of their body to execute goal-directed movement. The self-organization of the body during a handstand in some ways is similar to standing in terms of joint stacking. However, for a beginner, the coordinated movement patterns required for a handstand are inherently more difficult to perform. Firstly, during the skill, there is a small base of support and a large distance between the ground and the center of gravity, which both increase instability. In addition, the skill requires unusual activation of the upper limb musculature as they are required to adopt a gravity-resisting role to replace the lower limbs, which increases anterior-posterior sway as the upper limb function is much less resistant to postural fatigue. As humans are a complex neurobiological system, they are able to exploit the surrounding constraints in order to produce functional patterns of behavior in specific and differing performance contexts. Therefore, utilizing a constraints-led approach enables the learner to interact with varying constraints, develop and subsequently settle into stable, attractive patterns of behavior. According to Neal's model of constraints, constraints can be categorized as either organismic, environmental, or task, all of which interact and subsequently act on the learner. Organismic constraints refer to the physical characteristics related to the structure and function of the performer. In the context of a handstand, some of the relevant organismic constraints include the level of neuromuscular control, upper body strength, wrist range of motion, fear and anxiety of falling and injury. Environmental constraints refer to elements in the external environment, including surface area, ambient light, gravity, temperature, as well as social influences such as crowd. Gravity and surface area are two key environmental constraints experienced during a handstand. Finally, task constraints refer to the specific instructions, goals, and rules of a particular performance and significantly constrain functional movement patterns. In relation to a handstand, task constraints can be implemented as instructions such as walking up the wall or bunny hopping, as these constrain performers to achieve the goals of the task. By manipulating these constraints, particularly the task, perturbations can be added which disturb the learner's current stable movement patterns, enabling them to again self-organize into a new stable coordinated movement pattern in response to the novel situation. For example, when learning a handstand, I began with double leg bunny hopping onto the wall. This task was then changed to double leg bunny hopping with alternating leg extension so that only one leg remained in contact with the wall, forcing me to adopt a new movement pattern. This process of manipulating constraints can continue until the learner is able to effectively self-organize into functional movement patterns to perform the required skill in a varying array of situations where they have truly achieved skill acquisition. The rationale for my skills project was to employ the constraints-led approach to a 20-hour training program to attempt to learn and successfully perform a handstand. My program was divided into 3 phases which all followed steady progression in difficulty, paying particular focus on task and environmental constraint manipulation. Organismic constraints such as lack of acrobatic experience, fear, and poor neuromuscular control and range of motion in my right wrist all contributed to a poor initial performance of the skill. Therefore, to overcome these constraints, breaking down the program into 3 phases enabled to simplify the skill to develop the basic techniques and functional movements required to perform a wall-assisted handstand, with the aim of transferring this skill to a freestanding handstand upon completion of the program. Phase 1 included sessions 1 to 3 and required me to initially perform a bunny hop against the wall to introduce the motion and feeling of transferring my weight onto my hands and maintain a semi-inverted position. Once an attractor state was formed and I could confidently reproduce the movement each time, the task was again manipulated and I was required to alternate between extending one leg in the air. This introduced single leg support, increasing the amount of weight transferred onto my hands while slowly reducing my reliance on the external environment being the wall. Progression through phase 1 occurred relatively quickly and such performance outcomes were not reported. Rather, quality of performance production was used to assess performance. Once I felt comfortable and confident with each movement, I progressed into phase 2, which introduced more challenging tasks. Phase 2 utilized the initial motor pattern developed in Phase 1, which resembles the same weight-shifting motion required during a handstand. However, the task was manipulated to perturb this stable state of behavior that was formed. Phase 2 consisted of sessions 4 to 6 and 7 to 9, each consisting of 2 progressive exercises. During sessions 4 to 6, I was required to bunny hop onto the wall and then walk up it until I could comfortably reach a completely vertical position, with the distance between my hands and the wall being less than 15 centimeters. Once I was able to self-organize myself under these new constraints, I was progressed to session 7 to 9, where I again introduced single leg support by alternating between taking one leg off the wall. Progression from this task was allowed when 15 repetitions could be confidently performed. Performance outcomes were recorded during this phase, measuring initial and best attempts for each exercise to identify progression. These results will be demonstrated later. Phase 3 ran from sessions 10 to 13, 14 to 17, and 18 to 20, totaling 10 hours. During Phase 2, a stable state of behavior was achieved whereby I was able to maintain a completely vertical position by walking up the wall. To perturb this, during sessions 10 to 13, the task was changed so that I was required to perform a handstand kick up against the wall, which is a motion that closely resembles a true handstand. To progress from this stage, I was required to perform this movement confidently held for longer than 30 seconds. Furthermore, sessions 14 to 17 manipulated the task again, requiring me to perform the kick up while only using one leg to support myself on the wall, again forcing me to self-organize into a new functional behavior. Similarly, once this position could be held for longer than 30 seconds, I progressed to the final sessions. Sessions 18 to 19 were the final sessions where I tried to utilize all the functional patterns developed throughout each phase. The task required me to perform a handstand kick up against the wall, then attempt to come off it and hold this position. Performance outcomes were measured for each exercise, recording the time of the initial and best attempt, which were used to assess for progression. Finally, to assess for the complete skill acquisition, a transfer test was performed by attempting to execute a freestanding handstand away from the wall. 3 attempts were made and an average was recorded. This will be shown later in the results. During this constraint-led program, results were recorded to measure progression through each phase. These results were then tabulated and graphed to provide a visual depiction of progression. During stage 1 of the training program, the activities performed were not measured using objective measures to assess progression. Rather, progression through this stage was self-reported and assessed through confidence and comfortability to perform the movements. It is during phase 2 and 3 where objective measures were recorded to assess performance outcomes. Results from phase 2, sessions 4 to 6, demonstrate the change in distance from my initial and best attempts at wall walking. Recording 86 centimeters and 10 centimeters respectively, indicating a 73 centimeter reduction in the distance between my hands and the wall. Results from Phase 2, Sessions 7 to 9 measured the maximum repetitions of the task in hand, with my initial and best attempts achieving 6 and 20 repetitions respectively, demonstrating improvements in my ability to switch between single leg support. Results from Phase 3, Sessions 10 to 13 depict my ability to perform a handstand kick up and hold that position. An initial and best attempt of 2.3 and 32 seconds was recorded, demonstrating a significant improvement in my ability. Results from Phase 3, Sessions 14 and 17 illustrate my performance when executing a handstand kick up with a single leg hold. An initial and best attempt of 4.4 and 31 seconds was achieved, highlighting further improvement. Results from Phase 3, Sessions 18 to 20 measure my ability to hold a handstand position once coming off the wall. An initial and best attempt of 1.8 and 3.4 seconds were recorded. While improvement was made, it is clear that progression has significantly plateaued. This is likely due to my over-reliance on the wall for balance. Finally, results from the transfer test indicated where the skill acquisition had occurred, as I was required to perform a freestanding handstand without any assistance. 3 attempts were made, recording 2.3, 2.5, and 2.75 seconds, with an average of 2.52 seconds. While stable improvements in technique and assisted handstand times were achieved, from these results it was clear that skill acquisition had not occurred, as I was unable to maintain the position without any assistance. The constraints-led approach to skill acquisition is an effective method for learning, as the manipulation of varying constraints in an individual's learning environment enables emergent movement patterns to be brought about by the learner through their own intrinsic self-organization. This self-organization into stable attractor states is influenced and shaped by these various interacting constraints. Therefore, continuous manipulation is able to perturb the learner's stable behavior to force phase transitions where the learner enters a period of unstable movement until they ultimately are able to self-organize into an emerging stable pattern of behavior in response to the newly imposed constraints. This pattern of transitioning from unstable to stable patterns of functional movement is evident within the training program. When commencing the training program, I was completely unable to maintain a handstand position correctly, as I did not possess the required functional movement patterns to perform the skill, leaving me in an unstable state. Moreover, the task dynamics of a handstand require the individual to adopt and maintain an inverted posture. This is heavily contrasted to the task dynamics of walking and standing, which is a functional movement pattern that I've become accustomed to, which have shaped my intrinsic dynamics for movement. Therefore, for a stable pattern of behaviour to emerge, tasks and environmental constraints were manipulated to initially simplify the skill. By manipulating my environment, I was able to utilise a wall, which was an invariant feature I was able to exploit to use for support and stability. This enabled me to shift my weight onto my hands and adopt a semi-inverted posture, and through this self-organisation, a stable attractor state emerged. As seen in the results section, task constraints were continuously manipulated in order to facilitate phase transitions from stable to unstable to stable states. As seen in sessions 4 to 6, I was initially unable to execute a perfectly vertical posture when wall walking due to fear and inability to further support my weight on my hands. However, through constant practice of this movement, I eventually achieved a relatively vertical posture by reducing the distance between the wall and my hands to only 10 centimeters, evidently showing my self-organisation into a stable attractor state. Furthermore, significant progression was evident from sessions 7 to 18, as indicated by initial and best performances. As each task constraint was altered, it would disrupt the current attractor state formed from the previous session, continuously forcing me into phase transitions where I need to self-organise in response to the session's task to achieve the performance goals. While constant manipulation of the task constraints was the strength of this program, as it enabled continual early progression as I self-organised to perform each movement, eventually becoming more and more vertical with improved stability. The lack of variability and manipulation of the environment was a limitation to the program. Manipulating my environment by utilising a wall was essential for early learning of the task. However, as I progressed, I found myself entering a deep, stable attractor state where I became reliant on the wall to perform the handstand, which eventually hindered my ability to perform the handstand without assistance in later sessions. This is evident in my transfer test where I was required to perform a freestanding handstand without assistance. Ultimately, the results indicate that I was unable to consecutively maintain the position for an extended period of time, therefore concluding that skill acquisition did not truly occur. To conclude, the results of the program found that continual manipulation of task constraints were able to elicit improvements when performing a handstand. Major improvements in technique and increasing verticality were observed. However, progression maintaining the position unassisted was limited, largely due to a developed reliance on the wall for guidance, which became a deep, stable attractor state that was unable to be weakened with the current training program, likely due to a lack of variability. Overall, while significant improvements in my ability to perform the handstand with assistance were recorded, a failed transfer test indicates that skill acquisition was not truly achieved. Furthermore, a handstand is a very complex task that requires a high level of neuromuscular control, muscular endurance, and overall confidence to be in an inverted position, and therefore achieving complete skill acquisition in 20 hours is unrealistic. In literature, it has been said that to achieve expertise in a particular skill, 10,000 hours of deliberate and purposeful practice is required. While acquiring the ability to perform a handstand correctly could be achieved in much less time, it would be suggested that training programs should be longer than 20 hours in order to develop enough variability and practice to perform the skill in different situations. Overall, the general consensus in the existing literature is that the constraints-led approach is an effective method that can be practically applied to all aspects of skill acquisition, whether it be a sporting or rehabilitative context. The approach allows for individual progression by taking in different needs of each learner, and through manipulating relevant constraints, greater emphasis can be placed on areas that require improvement. This allows for functional movement patterns to emerge in response to those constraints without compromising the core objective of the skill.